Buddy, welcome back to Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens. This is the San Francisco Dharma Collective, and tonight is going to be part three of a sutta that we started a few weeks ago. We're going to be finishing probably tonight the Pañcattaya Sutta, the five and the three. This is sutta number 102 of the Majjhima Nikāya, the Middle Length Discourses. So, in case you weren't here last week or the week before, or you forgot, let me bring us up to speed of what's going on with the sutta tonight. So, we have come to the final 50 suttas of the Middle Length Discourses. And the sutta that we're doing tonight, this sutta is basically the Majjhima Nikāya, the Middle Length Discourses. It's their version, this version of the very, very first sutta in the Digha Nikāya, the long discourses of the Buddha. So, as you know, the Digha Nikāya, the long discourses, these are considered like the Buddha's greatest hits, right? And this is the first sutta of the Digha Nikāya. So it's a very important sutta. And that sutta is called the Brahmajala Sutta, Brahma's net. And in this very famous sutta, the Buddha describes 62 different drishtis, 62 different worldviews or cosmological views or cosmological speculations. But that's what the sutta is about, or at least the Brahmajala. It's the Buddha explaining all of these different worldviews. And I'm going to read a little bit from this sutta tonight. But the sutta that we're reading in this collection, it's kind of an abbreviated version. The Buddha doesn't go into quite as much detail as in the long discourse, right? So let me kind of quickly remind you of what the Buddha has told us up to this point. So the Buddha is telling the audience about all of these other Shramanyas and Brahmanyas, Shramans and Brahmins. These are different kinds of religious people. Maybe they are wandering ascetics. Maybe they are Brahmin priests. Maybe they are Brahmin practitioners of what you might call yoga. There's a bunch of them. There's a whole bunch of different ones. And the Buddha is describing to his audience what some of these other Shramanyas and Brahmanyas, what do they speculate about? What are their drishtis? Now, the sutta is divided into speculative views regarding the future, regarding the past, and regarding the present. The Buddha began by describing a bunch of different speculative views about the future. And these are ideas about what happens after we die. Now, in the first two sessions of this, so last week and the week before, I was sticking with the classic Indian Buddhist kind of the classic Buddhist understanding or Indian understanding of reincarnation. And I was explaining the various worldviews that the Buddha is laying out. I was explaining them in terms of reincarnation. But I actually realized that that might have given you a false understanding of what some of these speculative views are all about. So in order to review very quickly, I wanted to kind of recontextualize this. And what it is you don't have to presume or assume reincarnation. I'm going to presume a sort of a more Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Western idea of the afterlife. And that's the idea that maybe you go to a heavenly place forever, or you go to like a hellish place forever, or maybe there's some kind of limbo that you go to for a while before going to heaven or hell. Whatever it is, the Buddha begins by saying that there are some people that think that after death, the person, the atta, the atman, the soul, if you will, some people think that the atman, the atta, is with perception after death, meaning that like you're aware that you're in heaven, or you're aware that you're in hell, or you are aware that you're in some sort of limbo state. So there is perception. So some people think that after you die, you have perception. So that's view number one of the future. The Buddha says some Shramans and Brahmanyans, they say that you don't have perception after death. So yeah, you go to heaven, but you're not really aware of anything. You're just sort of in heaven. Then there's a third option of neither perception nor non-perception. So you go to heaven, and it's not that you're really like perceiving something, but you're not like totally unconscious. It's like a more subtle way of being. Okay, so those are the three options the Buddha lays out for the future: with perception, without perception, or neither with perception nor without perception. There's a fourth option, which is what the Buddhists would call annihilationism, that it's just over. There's nothing after death to be aware or to not be aware. So that's a kind of what we would call maybe materialism, scientific materialism. There's different names for this particular drishti, or this worldview. Now, really quickly, when the Buddha is describing, oh, and by the way, there's a fifth option. So there's three options of life after death. There's a fourth option of just total annihilation. And then the Buddha, in the very beginning of the sutra, he introduces the idea of nirvana now. And we don't really know exactly what he means by that, but in a little bit we will, because we're going to get to that part in the sutta. But those are the five possibilities. So with perception, no perception, neither nor perception, total annihilation, or nirvana now. Now, regarding you or the Atman, the soul, like that idea, regarding that going on after death, with perception or not with perception, or neither with perception or non-perception, the Buddha says that there's a few different people think, speculate, that there's a few different options for that. You might have form, or you might be formless. Let me explain, though, really quickly. This is important. So when the Buddhists talk about having form, they're talking about like having like a physical body of some kind. It's important to keep in mind that consciousness, though, like awareness, is considered formless. You can't take consciousness and like put it on a scale. Consciousness doesn't have a color or a size, or it's formless. So one possibility is that after death, you have form. You have some sort of body up in heaven, or you have some sort of body in hell. Or you might just be consciously aware. So you might be formless and you don't have a physical body at all. Or the Buddha says, maybe you actually have a little bit of form and a little bit of formlessness, which is a general way of thinking about the experience you're having now. Partially physical and embodied, partially mental and formless. So maybe life after death is not unlike this, where it's with body and with consciousness. There's an option of neither nor, of course, in that way. And the Buddha even adds a few possible other states, which are going to come back to tonight. But it's the idea that that consciousness after death, again, maybe up in heaven, in hell, some limbo zone. One option is that consciousness is only aware in one sensory way. It's what the texts call an awareness of unity, just oneness. Or life after death might be diversified, like seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, like five-dimensional sensory experience. So the Buddha lays out all of these different possibilities for a consciousness after death, or, and this is what we talked about last week, or we talked about just annihilationism. All of those teachings, the Buddha says no, and there's a big problem with every single one of those ideas about life after death. And the problem is that all of that way of thinking is conditional. It's relative. It's not absolute in that way. It's what the Buddhists call samskrita, conditional. Now, I'm not going to go over all of that because I want to get into the new stuff tonight. Yeah, actually, let's leave it at that. That's going to be our quick review of ideas regarding the future. And really quickly, if you weren't here, the reason why this sutta is called the five and the three is because at the very beginning, the Buddha says, oh yeah, those five views regarding the future, that after death you will have you have perception, no perception, neither perception or non-perception. The Buddha says those are all kind of the same idea. So we're going to wrap those into just one view. And then there's annihilationism and nirvana now. So there's really only three views. So what's happening here, if I didn't mention this last week or the week before, in the longer Brahmajala Sutta, the Buddha actually keeps elaborating. Like, so he'll take a particular view and then come at it from four different angles. It's how you get all the way up to 62 views. So my point is that in this sutta, the long one, the Buddha is elaborating. Interestingly, in the version we're reading, he's condensing. He's simplifying. It's interesting to watch that happen. Like, it's a thing about Buddhism of like condensing or expanding. I think it's why like computer programmers like Buddhism so much. This idea of like compression and expansion, it's really built into the tradition. I digress. So we've dealt now over 2 Sundays, we've dealt with all of these speculative views regarding the future. Tonight, we get into a new section. So I'm at paragraph or section 14, and we're about to get into the speculative views regarding the past. So this is a question of origins. So I want to kind of also just remind everybody that the topic tonight, this idea of a drishti, of a view, this is huge, this topic. In many ways, this topic of views, in many ways, it's why I started studying philosophy and then eventually started studying philosophy of religion and Buddhism. I was interested in this, like worldviews. Like, why do people believe what they believe? Why do they think what they think? Why do we think what we think? So I've always been very fascinated with different ideas about where all of this came from and where all of this is going. So the Buddha now is going to get into speculative views about where all of this came from. So about the past. So in section 14, he says, bhikkhus, practitioners. There are some recluses and Brahmins, some Shramanyas and Brahmanyans, who speculate about the past and hold views about the past, who assert views about the past. Some assert the self and the world are eternal. Only this is true. Anything else is wrong. All right, let's start with this one. I just want to break down a few things and then it'll start moving faster. But so there's a few components to this. The assertion, the dittihi or drishti, is that the atta, the self, the atman, and the loka, the world, the universe. So some people assert that the atta and the loka are eternal. Now, it's very helpful at this point to take a look at the longer discourse. Because if you don't know much about Buddhism and you read that, you might be a little unclear about what exactly they mean by all of that. Self, world, eternal. So what we want to do is we want to go over, if you happen to have this one, I'm jumping over to page 75. So this is how the Buddha describes this exact same view, but this is the like longer, more complete description. So what he says is, a time might come, bhikkhus, sooner or later, after a long period. Wait a minute, not is this? I'm sorry, I have the wrong section. Okay, well, I have the wrong sections. Oh, here it is. My apologies. I'm on page 71. He says some ascetics and Brahmins, some Shramanyas and Brahmanyans, feeding on the food given to them by the faithful, they make their living by base spiritual arts, like basically fortune telling and reading, doing fortune telling and readings. I'm going to skip to the chase because we'll be here all night. What he says is he walks the reader through a classic Buddhist description of developing kind of the supernatural powers. And then he says that that person gets into a meditative state and they start to become aware of their past lives. They become aware of one past life. They become aware of two past lives, 3, 4, 5, 10, a dozen past lives. And what he says is that eventually that person comes to the conclusion that they and the world are eternal. So that is pointing to an eternal atta or atman. So this word atman is it's a very old Sanskrit word. It's used in Indian philosophy. It's what we would translate as a self or a soul. But what you need to keep in mind is that the basic idea, and in case anybody is like missed this, we're not talking about Buddhism yet, right? We haven't been talking about Buddhism yet because the Buddha's been talking about what other people think about the future and the past. We're going to get to what the Buddha thinks tonight, but I just want to remind you, we're talking about speculative views. So even though we have heard the Buddha describe recalling past lives, what the Buddha's talking about is, yeah, somebody who has that experience and then comes to the final conclusion that they are eternal. And perhaps most importantly to the text, they assert that only that is true and everything else is wrong. I want to remind everybody that that's what's called a drishti, thinking that that's right and everything else is wrong. If you are wise and you are not clinging to the view and you are thinking maybe it's eternal, I don't know, but it might be. That's not a drishti. That's not a view. A view is a belief that, no, this is exactly what happened. So option number one is that the soul or the Atman has always been. Now, there's another part of this, by the way, of course, which is the world, the loka. And I just want to explain something really quickly. Let's, for a moment, I want to go back to the idea of a future. Those speculative views about the future. So 3 of those were about how you are going to go on, maybe with perception, maybe not with perception, or neither nor, right? But that's like one option, is that you're going to go on. Option number 2, or option number 4, is this annihilationism, right? This idea that, nope, after this configuration falls apart, there's just no more Atman. There's no more Atta. There's no more self, period. Now, in that view of annihilationism, where the self falls apart, we need to be thinking kind of existentially here. And what I mean is that in that way of thinking where the self is annihilated at death, there is the idea, though, that everything else goes on. You know, like the world and everybody else that didn't die that day. There's the idea that they're going to go on. But each individual, when they die, is completely annihilated. So everybody understand what I mean there, right? Well, what I just pointed at was the self versus the world. So the world is everything that you think is not you. The world. And so one idea is that the world and the Atman are eternal. They go back forever. All right, so now that we have all the language, any questions about that language of self, world, or eternal? speculative view number 2 regarding the past. Some people assert that the self and the world are not eternal, and that only this is true and everything else is wrong. So that idea that the self and the world are not eternal, that is basically the idea that the Atman or the Atta and the world have not always been, but at some point, and I'm filling in the blanks here, the idea is that at some point the self or the Atman got created, got like made, and now it is happening. And in the basic worldview that we're dealing with, the idea is that the Atman will go on to another life and go on to another life, but not being eternal, it will eventually kind of peter out. But we're only speculating about the past and the idea that the self and the world are not eternal, meaning there was a time when they were not. And then they were. Now they are. And that's where we're at. Speculative view number 3. Some Shramanyans and Brahmanyans assert that the self and the world are both eternal and not eternal, and that only this is true and everything else is wrong. This is a complicated view. It's a very complicated view about basically the idea that certain aspects of the world are eternal and other aspects are not. And in the longer sutta, the Buddha actually describes like these gods that, well, basically the example the Buddha gives of eternal, not eternal, he basically describes these gods that are in these really high heavenly realms who could be eternal if they were morally proper. But if they are not morally proper, they get corrupted and start falling into lower realms of rebirth and eventually become mortal beings that will die. So they have an opportunity to be eternal, but not necessarily. So that's one of the many examples actually the Buddha gives of partially eternal, partially not eternal. And then number 4, some people assert that the self and the world are neither eternal nor not eternal. And they say only this is true, everything else is wrong. That worldview, the Buddha chalks up to the people that pound things out through logic and reason. So they have come to the logical conclusion that the world and the self are not eternal nor not, or are neither eternal nor not eternal. But they only come to that decision through a kind of logic. All right, so those are the 4 views regarding the past, self and other, or self and world being eternal or not. Any questions about that? All right. The next set revolves around the idea of finite or not. So some people assert that the self and world are finite and that only that is true. Some people assert that the self and the world are infinite and that only that is true. Some people assert that the self and the world are both infinite and finite and only that is true. And some people assert that the world is neither finite nor infinite. Once again, and I won't do it, but if you read the full version here, it describes what the Buddha is actually talking about. And what it is it's about people that get into very deep meditative states, transcend the body, and actually gain a view of the universe from a kind of a disembodied state of consciousness. And the Buddha says that some people get into that and they see the world bounded by a ring. Now, this might be the great iron ring of mountains. That is a classic part of Buddhist cosmology, that the entire kind of universe is bounded by a ring of iron. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about this, but even in the modern world, there are speculative views about the universe having an edge or not. The idea of the world, the universe, being bounded, finite, or not. So I just want you to recognize that this like debate or this conversation about is the universe finite or infinite, we're still having this debate. So I just don't want anybody to think that this is like ancient history. All of these questions are still very much at play. So one option is that somebody in a meditative state sees that the world is finite and bounded, or in that same type of meditative state, they see that it just goes on forever and ever and ever. So that the universe is infinite in that way. Now, the third possibility, number 7, that it's both finite and infinite, the Buddha describes this as actually people who get into that same meditative state and they see that the world is bounded, finite up and down, but stretches infinitely in a kind of lateral direction, or vice versa, that it's infinite that way, but bounded this way. So that's the Buddha describing speculative views about the self and world being both finite and infinite. And then once again, the final one of these, number 8, neither finite nor infinite. The Buddha says, yeah, that's the logicians, that with logic, they can just wiggle their way around it and say, oh, it's neither finite nor infinite. So those are that's that set of 4. And by the way, these are all exactly what's taking place in the larger Brahmajala Sutta. Just the Buddha's just giving more background about how these views have been derived or come to. Next up, some people assert that the self and the world are percipient of unity, and that only this is true, whereas other people assert that the self and world are percipient of diversity. Once again, this is language that the Buddha introduced when he was talking about the future, and it was this idea of, and this is where you have to really read the longer version to understand what the Buddha is talking about, but he's talking in this way about like speculative views about the true self, the atta, the atman. So we need to understand that he's talking about the real self, not necessarily this physical body with its eyes and its ears and its nose and its tongue. Not necessarily. So regarding the past, there's a view that the self and the world are aware of or a percipient of unity. So this is the idea that the real self, the Atman, is only operating at a level of consciousness, a unity. This is what I meant before, or what I described before. Percipient of diversity is aware of different kinds of senses. Like sound, like, so the question is, up in heaven, Do you hear harps and like feel the clouds and smell the whatever? Like, is the world after death multi-sensual, or is it just like a mono sense of pleasure? Which, by the way, we're going to get to that idea in a second. But so that's what they're talking about. And I do want to mention that the commentators on this sutra note that these ideas in the Brahmajala Sutta are actually about the future, and it makes more sense as we heard about the future. The past is tricky, like how, the Atman in the past perceiving unity or perceiving diversity. It seems to be what they're talking about. But again, it makes a little more sense regarding the future, but I guess it doesn't really matter. But either way, there are these ideas about the true self, perceiving unity, perceiving diversity, perceiving the limited, or the self and the world are percipient of the immeasurable, and that only this is true and everything else is wrong. So the language of limited or immeasurable, it's Buddhist code language for these kind of meditative states. A limited, being percipient in a limited way, is a code word for the four dhyanas of form. The first four jhanas are considered limited because they are still in the realm of form and formal objects. Whereas the next four jhanas, the formless jhanas, are in the formless realm. So these are infinite space, infinite consciousness, infinite nothingness. They are immeasurable realms. So the speculation is in the past, is the true self, basically is the default mode of the true self being in the jhanas. Is the default mode of the true self being in the formless jhanas? There are speculations that that is what's going on. So that's the limited and that's the immeasurable. And now this is more language that's basically evocative, or, it's reminiscent of the jhanas. And what it is, he says, some people assert that the self and the world experience exclusively pleasure in the past, and that only that's true, everything else is wrong. Some people assert that the self and the world experience exclusively pain in the past. Some people assert that the self and the world experience both pleasure and pain, not unlike our terrestrial earthly experience in that way. And some people assert that the self and the world experience neither pleasure nor pain, and that only this is true, everything else is wrong. So again, this is all talking about these qualities of these meditative jhanas that are either pleasurable or not, or neither nor. And these are speculations, again, that the default mode, the way the natural state of the Atman is in the past, is some people speculate that the Atman is naturally in these pleasurable or not pleasurable or neither pleasurable nor pleasurable states. And that's true and everything else is wrong. Okay, I think that's it. Yep. Those are all the speculative views regarding the past. And the Buddha goes on to say, therein, bhikkhus, as to those recluses and Brahmins who hold such a doctrine and view as this, saying, the self and the world are eternal in the past, only this is true, everything else is wrong. The Buddha says, for people that think that hold that speculative view about the past, that the self and the world is eternal, he says that apart from faith, apart from approval, apart from oral tradition, apart from reasoned cogitation, and apart from the reflective acceptance of a view, he says they will have they will have any pure and clear personal knowledge of all that. That's impossible. So let me explain what he's saying there. We've heard these 5 things before: faith, approval, um, sorry, faith, approval, and oral tradition, reasoned cogitation, or accepting a view. These are the 5 ways that knowledge and information are passed on. The Buddha talks about these. And what he says about these 5 ways in which knowledge is passed on, he says all 5 of those things might turn out to be different. Meaning you can believe something out of faith, but the Buddha is saying, but if you only know it out of faith, you might be presented with some information later on where you change your view. So your faith is not fixed. It might change later. What everybody approves of socially, so this idea of just social approval, yeah, that might change in the future. The idea of an oral tradition that, well, I heard it from my parents, and my parents heard it from their parents, and their parents heard it from their parents. Oral tradition might turn out to be wrong or different in that way. And then, even if you've reasoned this out, you might get some new information and it'll prove your prior reasoning wrong. And then the last one is this idea of reflective acceptance of a drishti. So this is not about blindly holding a view. It's like you went to school, you thought about this, you were taught this, and you were like, you know what? I think it's the Big Bang. I think there was a Big Bang. That's the beginning of it all. So I'm going to accept the scientific view of what is called the Big Bang, let's say. Well, that might turn out to be wrong. That might turn out to be different later on. So what the Buddha's saying is that anybody that holds any of those views regarding the past and the future, the ones that we talked about in the weeks before, he's saying none of them can claim to have a pure, clear, personal knowledge of that. And since they have no clear, pure, personal knowledge of all that, even the mere fragmentary knowledge that those good recluses and Brahmins clarify about their view, it's all declared to be clinging on their part. So all of those views, the Buddha says people are clinging to it. And he says it is all of those views are conditioned and gross. But there is cessation of conditioning, or the cessation of samskara, of volitional formations. And having known, there's this. Seeing the escape from that, the Tathagata has gone beyond that. All right, so that paragraph, we've heard it several times now. So it's kind of a refrain in the sutta. And the refrain is this idea that what those people are teaching is conditioned and gross. And I'm always reminding everybody, they don't mean icky gross or nasty gross. They just mean like obvious versus subtle. Buddhism is into the subtle, not into the gross, obvious, in your face, right? So the Buddha is saying that these views regarding the atta, the self and the world, that they are conditioned and gross. But there is cessation of samskara. So this is the Buddhist message, that all of this is habitual. The things that you want, the way that you think, the things that you say, it's all habits and conditions. But Buddhism is actually about getting rid of habits, getting completely rid of habituated behavior, and actually having sovereign, free behavior that is not conditioned. So that's what the Buddha's after. We're going to hear about it. We're going to hear what that means about in a second. But that's what the Buddha's describing, is the cessation of formations. Now, I want to say something because I might miss the opportunity. So I want to say it now, but it's actually setting us up for what we're about to get into. It's when the Buddha says, having known there is this. And that's like in quotes, that this is what the Buddha has figured out, that there's this. Therefore, seeing escape from that, the Tathagata's gone beyond that. What does it mean there's this? Well, as always, of course, this is just the Dharma according to Michael, right? So this is just interpretation. But my understanding of that comment, that the Buddha has seen, or the Buddha understands or knows that there's this, I wanted to say this now, but we're going to actually get to it. But what it is I want you to just be thinking about what we keep calling speculative views, right? And these are speculative views about the past, right? That it might have been this way or it might have been that way. And the Buddha's saying nobody's going to really have pure, clear, direct knowledge of that. The future, I mean, the last time I checked, most people think the future is pretty unwritten, right? So the idea of the future, who knows? Could go this way, could go that way. In other words, what the Buddha's saying is that knowledge about the past, you can't have it. Knowledge about the future, you can't really have it. You know what you can have? Knowledge of this. That is true, that there's this. And what's interesting about this from like a philosopher's point of view is, like, even though I'm not over there with you, you know, where whatever you're doing over there, even though I'm not over there, I know that this idea of there is this, I know that it's like, I know that you're having that experience. Now, I don't know what it's like, but I know there's that in that sense. So the Buddha's pointing to what we can know versus what is speculative views. And the key thing here, because I don't want anyone to be confused, the key thing here is about clinging to some view about the past as the truth and the only truth. That's the problem that the Buddha's talking about, as far as I can tell. Not, thinking about the past and the future, wondering about the past and future. It's this idea of like, no, I know exactly what happened 5 billion years ago. It's much wiser to be like, I don't really know, but I know there's this. Okay, so we're going to get to this, but I just could, because we've already encountered that statement a few times, I wanted to mention it. All right, unless there's any comments or questions. Yeah, Noe.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, there is this. A couple weeks ago, I believe you referred to this as in the Four Noble Truths. Okay, thank you.
And the two are related in that what the teaching of the Four Noble Truths is also pointing at is what can be known. It's the Four Noble Truths are about the suffering nature of this, but it is pointing to the same this in that way. Okay, so let's do this. I'm very excited. We get to kind of get the conclusion of this beautiful sutta. So I'm jumping down to section 16, or paragraph 16. The Buddha or the Tathagata has gone beyond all of those speculative views. And then he says, therein, bhikkhus, as to those recluses and Brahmins who hold such a doctrine and view as this, that the self and the world are not eternal, or both eternal and not eternal. He goes through the whole list of all the views regarding the past. He says, since they have he repeats the thing that we said before, but this is pertaining to all the views, that since they have no pure and clear knowledge, personal knowledge, even the mere fragmentary knowledge that those good recluses and Brahmins clarify about their view is declared to be clinging on their part. All of that is conditioned and gross, but there is the cessation of conditioning. Having known there is this, seeing the escape from that, the Tathagata has gone beyond all of that. Now, finally to that fifth and final view of nirvana here and now, which the Buddha was describing as a speculative view. But wait, I thought that's what we were going for. Nirvana here and now, right? Well, pay really close attention. Here, bhikkhus, some recluses and Brahmins, with the relinquishing of views, about the past, the relinquishing of views about the future, and through complete lack of resolve upon the fetters of sensual pleasure. So not messing around with sensual pleasures. They enter upon and abide in the rapture of seclusion. You know about the rapture of seclusion. That's the first jhana. The first jhana is where you are pleased, rapturous. You have piti, priti, by being removed from sensual pleasures, not needing them. So the Buddha is describing a good recluse or a Brahmin who has actually stopped clinging to views, stopped pursuing sensual pleasures, and has entered the first jhana and abides in the rapture of seclusion. And they think, this is peaceful. This is sublime. That I enter upon and abide in the rapture of seclusion. But then, that rapture of seclusion ceases in that person. And with the cessation of the rapture of seclusion, grief arises. But then with the cessation of grief, the rapture of seclusion arises again. Just as the sunlight pervades the area that the shadow leaves, and the shadow pervades the area that the sunlight leaves, so too, with the cessation of the rapture of seclusion, grief arises. But then with the cessation of grief, the rapture of seclusion arises. The Tathagata, bhikkhus, understands this way. This good recluse or Brahmin, with the relinquishing of views about the past and the future, and with the cessation of grief, the rapture of seclusion arises in them. That's conditioned and gross. But there is the cessation of formations, or the cessation of conditioned habits. Having known there is this, seeing the escape from that, the Tathagata's gone beyond the pleasure of seclusion, gone beyond that. Here, bhikkhus, some recluse or some Brahmin, with the relinquishing of views about the past and relinquishing views about the future, through a complete lack of resolve upon the fetters of sensual pleasures, and with the surmounting of the rapture of seclusion, they enter upon and abide in transcendent or unworldly pleasure, which is a code language for the third jhana. The third jhana is considered otherworldly pleasure, not just pleasure from seclusion, but transcendent. So we skipped the second jhana, by the way. It was sort of wrapped up in the first one, just in case you were concerned. So now our recluse or Brahmin, who's let go of views about the past and the future, who's let go of sensual pleasures, they've even gone past the pleasure or the rapture of seclusion, and they enter upon and abide in this unworldly transcendent pleasure. And they think, this is peaceful. This is sublime, that I enter upon and abide in such unworldly pleasure. But that transcendent, otherworldly pleasure of the third jhana ceases. And with the cessation of unworldly pleasure, he falls back to that rapture of seclusion. The rapture of seclusion arises. And then, with the cessation of the rapture of seclusion, that otherworldly transcendent pleasure arises again. Just as the sunlight pervades an area where and the shadows leave, and the shadows pervade the area where the sunlight leaves, so too, with the cessation of worldly pleasure, the rapture of seclusion arises. But with the cessation of the rapture of seclusion, unworldly transcendent pleasure arises. The Buddha, the Tathagata, the Tathagata bhikkhus understands all of this way. This good recluse or Brahmin, by relinquishing views about the past and the future, and with the cessation of the rapture of seclusion, unworldly transcendent pleasure arises. But that, it's relative, it's conditioned and gross. But there is cessation of conditioned habits, and having known there's this, seeing the escape from all that, the Tathagata's gone beyond unworldly pleasure. Here, bhikkhus, some recluse or Brahmin, with the relinquishing of views about the past and the future, through a complete lack of interest or resolve upon the fetters of sensual pleasure, and with the surmounting of the rapture of seclusion and the rapture of unworldly pleasure, or there's no rapture actually in the unworldly pleasure, I misspoke, just being technically correct there. So they think, sorry, I lost my spot. So with the surmounting of the rapture of seclusion and unworldly pleasure, they enter upon and abide in neither painful nor pleasant feelings. That's code language for the fourth jhana, beyond pleasure and pain, even unworldly or even transcendent pleasure. We're beyond that. So the fourth jhana is beyond pleasure and pain. And our recluse or Brahmin who's made it, they think, this is peaceful. This is sublime, that I enter upon and abide in neither painful nor pleasant feelings. And then that neither painful nor pleasant feeling ceases in that person. And with the cessation of neither painful nor pleasant feelings, that unworldly transcendent pleasure of the third jhana comes back and arises. But then with the cessation of that unworldly pleasure, we're back to the neither painful nor pleasant feelings of the fourth jhana which arises. Just like the sunlight pervades an area and the shadow leaves, or the shadow pervades an area and the sunlight leaves, so too with the cessation of neither painful nor pleasant feelings, unworldly pleasure arises, but when with the cessation of that unworldly pleasure, neither painful nor pleasant feelings arise. The Buddha, the Tathagata, understands this way, bhikkhus. This good recluse or Brahmin, with the relinquishing of views about the past and the future, and relinquishing all pleasure, and so on, and with the cessation of unworldly pleasure, neither painful nor pleasant feelings arise. That is conditioned and gross. But there is cessation of conditioned habits. Having known there's this, seeing the escape from that, the Tathagata has gone beyond all that. So even gone beyond the fourth jhana of neither painful nor pleasant feelings. Here, bhikkhus, some recluse or Brahmin, with the relinquishing of views about the past and the future, through a complete lack of resolve upon the fetters of sensual pleasure, and with the surmounting of the rapture of seclusion, the unworldly pleasure of the third jhana, and surmounting the neither painful nor pleasant feeling of the fourth jhana, that person regards themselves thinking, I'm at peace. I've attained nirvana. I'm without clinging. Now, even before we read the next paragraph, I do want to tell you, Bhikkhu Bodhi, the master, Bhikkhu Bodhi, has a great footnote about the way that all of this is written. And the language of all of this is very intentionally, very conspicuously inclusive of this first person I. I've attained nirvana. I'm at peace. I'm without clinging. So very, if we don't speak Pali, we're not reading the Pali, but in the original, that would have supposedly jumped out at us. The Tathagata bhikkhus understands this way. This good recluse or Brahmin, with the relinquishing of views about the past and the future, regards himself this way, thinking, I'm at peace. I've attained nirvana. I'm without clinging. Certainly this venerable one asserts the way directed to nirvana. Yet this good recluse or Brahmin still clings, clinging either to a view about the past, or to a view about the future, or to a fetter of sensual pleasure, or to the rapture of seclusion, or to unworldly pleasure, or to neither painful nor pleasant feelings. And when this venerable one regards himself this way, thinking, I'm at peace, I've attained nirvana, I'm without clinging, that too is declared to be clinging on the part of this good recluse or Brahmin. All of that is conditioned and gross. But there is cessation of formations. Having understood there's this, seeing the escape from that, the Tathagata's gone beyond even all of that. Bhikkhus, this sublime or this supreme state of sublime peace has been discovered by the Tathagata. That is, liberation through not clinging. By understanding as they actually are the origination, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of the 6 bases of contact. Bhikkhus, that is the supreme state of sublime peace discovered by the Tathagata. That is liberation through not clinging. By understanding as they actually are the origination, the disappearance, the gratification, and the danger and escape in the case of the 6 bases of sensual contact. That's what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. All right, let's discuss. So in many ways, it's kind of the simplest Dharma teaching that I think I've ever read. As crazy as that is, because we spent 3 days on this, talking about all of these crazy speculative views, but at the end, the Dharma message of, no, I'm teaching liberation from not clinging. That's it. But let's discuss. So, this is a very interesting sutta for a number of reasons. Anybody have any particular points they'd like to discuss or want to mention? Any? I of course have tons I want to say, but any? Well, before we get to the Buddha's message in that way, let's kind of take a step back to his describing of this kind of process. So the first thing I want to point out, I do think that this sutta is still meant to be very instructive. And what I mean by that is that I do think that we are to read the description of, first of all, so he describes, some recluse or Brahmin. Could be anybody. And he says it starts, so I'm going all the way back to section 17, the beginning of the nirvana here and now. And he starts by saying, let's say some recluse or Brahmin relinquishes views about the past and the future. So that's step 1. Relinquishing views about the past and the future. So what I'm getting at is that even though the Buddha is describing this as like a recluse or a Brahmin, and he's ultimately going to say that that recluse or Brahmin is still clinging when they claim to have attained nirvana, I don't think that we should throw out the description of the person achieving that state, if you know what I mean. So the first step is relinquishing that. Again, it's the certainty, this attachment to a certainty about the past or the future. Just don't hold it so tightly in that way, right? So that's the first step, relinquishing views about the past and the future. The next step, which is a classic Buddhist step, stepping away from sensual pleasures. So a complete lack of resolve on the fetters of sensual pleasure. So not looking to, listen to something for pleasure, or look at something, or taste something, or smell something, or touch something, or even in a way think about something. So not trying to get pleasure from things. That's the next step. And then, if you could successfully do that, such a recluse or a Brahmin enters in the rapture of seclusion. And by the way, I couldn't help but think, I have a little note here, When I read this, maybe this was last week or whenever I first read this recently, and I was reading, and it wasn't it wasn't a necessarily a Buddhist. It was just some recluse or some Brahmin. When it was describing just some recluse, could be anybody, abiding in the rapture of seclusion, I couldn't help but think of Henry David Thoreau and the Transcendentalists and Living on Walden Pond. So much of Thoreau's description of living on Walden Pond is about the rapture of seclusion. That's why he was so, if you read on self-reliance, I think is his another little essay he wrote, or actually that might have been Emerson. But either way, these transcendentalists, they were really into apparently the rapture of seclusion, like the joy of removing oneself from it all. So I just wanted to point out that there was like a little bit of overlap with other traditions. But then what the Buddha says about all of these, so the joy of seclusion, or the piti or priti of seclusion, and then even the transcendent or other unworldly pleasure of the third jhana, even neither perception nor non-perception, the Buddha describes all of those as conditioned and gross. Now, it's better than it could be in that way, meaning being in such a rapturously joyful state is certainly good. But what the Buddha's pointing at is that such a state is only a state relative to some other state, right? It's kind of like this idea. This is like a classic question of moral, like kind of moral philosophy. But the idea is that if you had like 100 or no, let's say 200 pounds of weight put on your shoulders, if I came along and took 100 pounds off of that, is that pleasurable? Well, it's more pleasurable than having 200 pounds, but I still have 100 pounds of weight. Ah, so the joy, if you could call it that, the joy of only having 100 pounds is relative to a moment ago when I had 200 pounds. So yeah, it's pleasurable to have only 100 pounds, but it's only pleasurable relative. It's not actually pleasurable. Now let's take my example a step further. All 200 pounds, all 200 pounds have been removed. Are you pleased? Are you pleasant? Like, of course, you've just had 200 pounds that have been burdening you removed. But isn't your pleasure relative to not having 200 pounds of weight on you? It's not really a pleasure that is unconditioned. It's relative in that way. So my example of having hundreds of pounds of weight is basically the idea of moving through the jhanas. And yeah, you're removing psychic weight. You're removing burdens. You're removing all of these things. So it's getting better. But that joy is relative to the way you were before. And all of this is reminding me of that really powerful section that we read last week. It was the section on the annihilationists. And it's where the Buddha describes even the people that are dead set on this idea that, nope, once I die, it's all over. The Buddha describes that as a deep, deep connection to an identity. Yeah, you think you are gonna die, but that belief is entirely attached to this entity. And that's what the Buddha's talking about. It's why one of the main teachings of the Buddha is called anatta. No atta, no atman. All of the views that the Buddha described are predicated, they presume an atman or an atta. And the question is, oh, does the atta keep going after you die? Does the atta just fall apart after you die? But the Buddha asked the important question, which is, what is that atta, that atman? What is that? And the realization seems to be, oh, that's clinging. There isn't anything. It's a verb, not a noun, is the thing. So the self, the atma, is this clinging to an axis of karma in that way. That's what I hear the Buddha saying, especially with this idea of the annihilationists being like a dog on a leash running around a pole. They can't get away from that notion of a self, even though they're annihilationists. All right, so that's the Buddha describing that even if you get up into the exalted state of the fourth jhana, the state of neither perception or non-perception, that is still a conditional state. It's still relative. And it's only when we get to the end, when we get to the end, and the Buddha explains this idea that, well, I'm trying to find just the right line. It's the whole last part. I would just have to read the entire last part again. But the idea here is that the Buddha's identifying that it's this clinging. And what he says is this great line that, where's the great line? Liberation through not clinging. Now, I want to remind everybody, yeah, the Buddha is certainly in a way talking about a kind of literal, clinging, but he's talking much more about a mental clinging, much more about a kind of mental attachment or that kind of clinging in that way. And so I want to get back to the line that there is this. So I mentioned before that when the Buddha says there is this, it seems to me that he is pointing at this in that way. Now, the thing about it is that there's this, but what is this? I wanted to just say a little bit more about that idea. And I'm going to try to keep in line with the tradition that this sutta is coming from. What I mean is I'm going to try to do it in a slightly more Theravada way. But the basic idea, or one way to get to think of the idea of there is this, it's to really consider what one aspect of what the Buddha is talking about. It's the idea of what we might call a presently arisen state of conscious awareness, which would be this. So this is welcome to your present state of conscious awareness, right? And the idea of this present state of conscious awareness is that it is entirely the product of now, like meaning the things that I'm saying, whatever's going on around you in the room, in other words, whatever input, whatever it might be, the present state of conscious awareness is sort of the emergent result of what's going on right now. And the point of that is that this present state of conscious awareness, this is not what was at Dharma doors last week. How could this presently arisen state of conscious awareness that's based on these sensory stimuli, how could this presently arisen state of conscious awareness possibly have been the arisen state of conscious awareness last week? It doesn't make any sense. Now, what you might be thinking, though, is that there's me. And I was here last Sunday night at Dharma doors. And I'm here now at Dharma doors. And I will be here next week at Dharma doors. Makes pretty normal sense, right? The idea that I was the guy that taught Dharma doors last week, and I'm the guy teaching Dharma doors this week, and I'll be the guy teaching Dharma doors next week. It all makes perfect kind of sense, right? Well, that's the amnesia. That's the allure of the self that we forget. So what I'm pointing at is that there's one way of thinking about what's going on here. And one way of thinking about it is that there's a self and that this is just the latest thing happening to the self. That's one thing. The other way of thinking of the self is a presently arisen state of conscious awareness. Now, one of those, the second one, the presently arisen state of conscious awareness, that's pretty hard to argue against because it's what's going on. But if I asked you to try to find that what little Atman, what self was here last week, is here now, and will be here next week? Like, what's the actual, is this what you're calling the self? Like, because the body, but was it this body here last week? What I'm doing, or what I'm attempting to do, is I want you to notice how the whole me in the past that is now here and that will be, that's just clinging. It's all it is a verb of like identity attachment. Whereas this presently arisen state of conscious awareness, like if you get into this idea, then you start to become this evolving, ever evolving self that is never the same self at any moment and is actually always becoming anew in that way. And from a Buddhist point of view, this is very important because we recognize, oh, this is the result of all of that. So that means next week is going to be a whole other kind of person in that way. I bet that person would appreciate it if I bathed and took care of this body. Like, because they're going to wake up in a week pretty stoked to have a nice, healthy, clean body. Whereas if I start poisoning this body, whoever that is a week from now is probably not going to be very stoked about the situation. So you see how there is responsibility, there is karmic consequences. So nobody's off the hook regarding karmic consequences and responsibility. It's just a matter of how we think or what we think all of this is in that way. Just putting all of that out there. Again, such a simple Dharma message. What is the Buddha teaching? Liberation through not clinging. Not clinging to what? Yeah, not clinging. Writ large. So that's the Dharma message tonight. Questions, comments, answers, ideas about the liberation of not clinging, ideas of self.
Well done. Well done. Well done. Jeez. I really appreciate it. So much to say, but I was just listening. But I would just say, yeah, appreciate this 3 times taking the time to do this. And yeah, how beautifully you put that analysis of each view and the similarity of each, the conditional and gross. And I think you did an excellent job when you did a person like you years before when you did a 62 views. I remember you had a saying of like, all of them are there, so which is it? Like the idea that there is this clinical perceptive of each one. As an agreeable person, of course, each one is true. Each one is equal. Each one is conditional. Just the fact that they all exist, especially taking the account of 62, show you that it's impossible that one is right. Because and I think that clinical language is so hard to nail it down, and you translate it really well. Because the 62 goes to 5, and they go to 3, and they eventually go to 2, and then
kind of just one in that way.
And then exactly. So thank you so much for this journey.
Thank you, Ophir. Thank you so much. Maria.
Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like we're, at least for me, we're always back to this place of trying to hold, okay, I probably should wash this body, knowing that, it's not happening to me. It's that there is, this whole delusion of the self, and that there's this responsibility that comes along with it, and then holding that truth, it's the 2 truths again, that there is no self, and that, well, there's a practical self, and then there's the delusional self. So I feel like that's the tricky part. And so, at least from this view, so to speak, it always seems to come back to that.
Thanks, Maria. Robin, do you have something?
Was where does that's opposite of this come in, or is it it's more suchness, really?
I'm glad you asked. I made a conscious decision to not talk about something because it would have been a lot. At the very end, the last paragraph, the Buddha mentions this thing about there's liberation through not clinging by understanding as they actually are the origination, disappearance, gratification, danger, and escape from the senses or from the 6 sense bases. So the key word there is about understanding the origination. So the key was dependent origination. And in the world of Buddhism, the Buddha always summarizes dependent origination by the phrase, as soon as you have this, you have that. And there's a way in which he means it, I think, that he means it sort of simply, that as soon as you say this, you make a that. You never get to have a this without a that. But then what he means by extension is actually about, basically, he's talking about the 12 links of dependent origination. And if you have any one of them, you have the other ones. So if you have, say, birth, if you have this, birth, you're going to have that, meaning death. And you never get to have just birth. Like, oh, just forever, like born and then that's it. Nope. If you're in the framework of birth, you're in the framework of death. It's a package deal, this and that. They always come together. So, all right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. That's 8:30. I'm going to call it a night. We are done here with our 5 and 3 sutta. So we're going to move on probably next week to Sutta 103. But stay tuned for that. I hope you can make it next week. Thank you all as usual for being here. Always
Thank
love
you,
seeing everybody
Michael.
on Sunday nights.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Thank you. Thank you all.